Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the ICFJ Panel World Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. Our planet faces a series of intensifying emergencies today, including rising temperatures, which are causing more frequent and intense climate disasters, habitat loss and other pressure threaten to push an estimated 1 million species into extinction. Furthermore, pollution also continues to poison the air we breathe, the land we inhabit, and the water we drink. And which is why World Environment Day, which this year falls on June 5, a couple of days from now, the goal for this year is to promote awareness and action to protect our environment. This event has been held annually by the United Nations since 1974, and it has grown today to become a truly global platform that brings attention to the issues facing the climate. So at the ICFJ Pamela Howard Global Crisis Reporting Forum, we are commemorating World Environment Day today with a webinar to discuss environment journalism and what it takes to run a climate-focused media outlet. Our guest today, I'm glad to be joined by Sebastian Rodriguez, who is the editor-in-chief of Climate Tracker. Climate Tracker is an international non-profit organization that supports and trains environmental reporters globally. Sebastian himself is a climate and environmental journalist and has published his reporting in Reuters, DW Mogambe, and China Dialogue. So I would like to say thank you for joining us today, Sebastian. How are you doing?
Thanks to you, Paul. I'm very well, thank you. And I like to also welcome everyone who's joining the webinar.
Yes, well, welcome everybody that is joining the webinar. We are always excited to know where you are joining us from. So if you can just pop into the chat box and tell us where you are joining us from, we are going to appreciate it. And you are not left out in the conversation today. If you'd like to engage with us in any way, or if you would like to ask Sebastian any question at any point in time, do not wait until the end of his presentation. You can use the Q&A option on the Zoom platform for your questions. If you are joining us on Facebook, please use the chat box under the live video that you are watching right now to engage with us, and we would like to know what are your thoughts regarding this, and also your positions and your opinions on the subject of discussion. So yes, before we go into Sebastian, one of the personal concerns that someone like me always have is when it has to do with issues of the environment, dialogues. Do you see it as something to be excited about this year? Are you convinced about the progress that we've made so far and how journalism has progressed? Just before we go into your presentation, what are your personal?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the issue of hope, really covering the climate crisis and in general the environmental collapse, is a huge topic of discussion, and even in among technical circles. But definitely, I think there are many reasons to be hopeful about the future and about not only you know possibilities to solve the climate crisis and the environmental collapse, but also from the reporting and journalistic perspective. I think there are also many reasons to be hopeful and to be excited uh, about this bit that has been growing at an increasing rate in the past few years, and that I've been really excited to see so many colleagues joining the climate issue. So yeah, for me, I think that there are many reasons, but the main one probably, and the one that we should stick the most to, is the latest climate science, right? If every UN climate science report, if it had shut the doors to the possibility of reducing climate change, then we wouldn't, why even bother covering, right? But that is not the case at all. In fact, every climate science report that comes out, or in fact, the latest climate science reports that have come out in the past few months, all tell us that we are in a tough situation and that we need to get our act together and fast. But there is still hope, and there are still possibilities and clear paths and actions that we can take to mitigate the climate crisis.
Yes, so on that note, I would like you to start sharing your screen. So you can start sharing your screen before, while doing that, I'd like to engage our audience. If you identify as an environmental journalist, if that is what you do exclusively, indicate in the chat box. Yes, so let me know if you are an environmental journalist so that we know how many of you are joining us live today. And if you're not, if you're just interested in, you can also indicate in the chat box, and I'll get back to that request at the end of Sebastian's presentation. So Sylvester, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Paul. And thanks again, everyone who's joining to this webinar. As Paul mentioned, my name is Sebastian Rodriguez. I'm a journalist based in Costa Rica, which is a small country in Central America. And I'm the editor-in-chief with Climate Tracker, which is a nonprofit that that supports climate journalists all over the world. I am in charge of the editorial kind of branch of the organization. And basically, first I'm going to do a brief kind of a brief review of what we do. So our work consists mainly on, as I mentioned, on supporting journalists. So that involves, in many cases, opening up opportunities, especially to people in the global south, who don't typically have the same access to opportunities or to information or even sources or data on climate change. So our work is mainly focused on strengthening that coverage and strengthening the capacities of journalists in the global south. And so that's a huge focus for us. This is an example of that work. This is part of our group that we took to the last COP26 in Glasgow in the UK. Which is where the UN meets to kind of find or to agree on solutions for climate change and to agree on global actions aimed at mitigating climate change. So these meetings are supposed to happen, on a rotating basis. So once every year, they happen in a different part of the world. But the fact is that in the past, I don't know, 3 or 4 meetings, they have all been in Europe, which, is a major restriction for most of the journalists in the world who are not covering from the global north. And so we try to open a path for them to be able to cover this event, which in the end has repercussions all over the world. So this was part of our group. We took a group of 10 journalists, and we had more than 30 fellows to cover COP26. 20 of them did it online through our online platform, and so they went through a number of workshops with us and capacity building. So they had a strong basis on how to find information, on how to understand what was going on and what were the main issues of discussion here at COP. So we'll talk a bit more about what COP is in a few minutes, briefly. On the editorial side, Climate Tracker focuses a lot on expanding climate coverage all over the world. So, for example, we have a number of mentorship programs that we open up every year, and we assemble a group of really talented journalists from all over the world, also young journalists from all over the world. And we give them the necessary tools, the necessary mentorship, and we publish some of these stories ourselves. So we are really aimed at strengthening climate coverage, and we also have a number of initiatives aimed at receiving stories from all over the world. So I highly suggest everyone who's interested in publishing more or getting started in climate freelancing or even just learning about climate change, to follow on our socials, because that's where most of our stories are shared, and that's where we also open opportunities for other journalists across the globe to collaborate on our platform. So first, I want to do a brief introduction to climate change so that everyone's on the same page. I'm gonna talk now a bit about. I'm gonna give you a few tips on what to include in your climate stories when you're working on them, and why cover these climate stories. So I'm going to first do a brief recap on what climate change is, so that everybody's on the same page. I know there may be some people that might already know much of this, but hopefully we can all be on the same page after this brief recap. So this is a very famous graph by now. It's called it's part of an initiative called Show Your Stripes, which aims at visualizing the increase in temperature of the last century in a much more engaging way. So I really like this data visualization because it becomes really evident when you see it on this scale and with these colors that something's going on, right? So here, what's going on is you have a baseline of how much temperature changes every year. So what scientists did was coming up with a baseline and seeing how much cooler or hotter was a given year relative to that baseline. So you can see here that, for example, in the 1850s, most years tend to be a lot cooler than the baseline that we're setting up here. So what's going on here is that years are becoming increasingly hotter. The difference from the baseline gets reduced gradually until suddenly we have here a spike of a given year right around the second half of the 20th century, where we start to see years that are above our baseline. And almost every year after that, especially in the 21st century, almost every year has been above that baseline. So every year has been hotter than the average temperature. So you can see here how evident is the temperature increase. So we do know that something's happening. Something is messing up the atmosphere, and this is having really really dangerous impacts on our planet. It's increasing. Well, the latest climate science reports from the UN, from an organization called the IPCC, which is where all of the climate scientists in the world kind of convene to come up with a global climate science report. And these reports show us that something that is unequivocally happening, and it has to do with human activity. So here is where you can see another very useful graph, I think. And I'm saying it's really linked to human activity because climate change is a phenomenon caused by humans, as the IPCC has stated in the last few reports. They have been much more clear on the phrasing, and they now have stated that climate change is unequivocally caused by humans and by human activity, particularly because of a group of a few gases called greenhouse gases, but in particular this gas called carbon dioxide. So this gas is really really tightly linked to the way that we use energy and to the way that we perform a number of other activities, such as, for example, agriculture or industry. But really, the most important contribution to this is how are we how are we powering our energy systems? Because essentially we're turning the atmosphere, this public domain that no one can claim, and that is, part of everyone's domain. We're turning that into a huge dumpster for this gas, which is the result of mostly from burning fossil fuels. So this gas, as you can see, is very, very tightly correlated with temperature increase. So on black, you can see the temperature increase registered in the last century, and you can see in red the carbon dioxide concentrations on the atmosphere. So they are completely linked, and now there is more evidence than ever that that this gas is the main driver of climate change. It has a bunch of particularities and of particular characteristics that I think are important to go over. For example, it lives quite a number of years in the atmosphere. So if you emit carbon dioxide, it will stay in the atmosphere a lot more time than other gases. So, for example, methane is another greenhouse gas that comes typically from the burning of for example, agriculture in the use of cattle. It also comes from natural gas, often from leaks in natural gas power plants. So this gas is many times more potent than carbon dioxide, and it can trap a lot more heat and heat the atmosphere a lot more. But it leaves the atmosphere a lot sooner than carbon dioxide. So this is one of the main characteristics, and also another thing that's very important is just how abundant it is. So most of our emissions, historical emissions, come from carbon dioxide. And so one key thing also to keep in mind when you're covering your climate stories is that not everyone emitted that gas on an equal amount. So you can see here, I really like this visualization that's from Carbon Brief, which is an English a media outlet from the UK. And I really like this visualization because it allows you to see over the years just how much CO2 emissions are concentrated in the global north, particularly. So these are the main emitters. At this time, you can see the year here is changing, and you can see how much of a difference there is between the US and other countries. The other countries at play are also mostly from the global north. So there are also some of the major economies. But as I mentioned before, carbon dioxide is really tightly linked to the way that we use energy. So of course, the most energy intensive countries and the bigger economies tend to emit more CO2. So in recent years, these are the historical emissions. In recent years, China has become another major emitter. But of course, in historical terms, the US is still the biggest emitter. I'm sorry. So I think that's a really useful visualization because it allows you to really understand the inequalities that there are on emissions and the injustices as well, because we are reporting the stories mostly from the global south ourselves in Climate Tracker, and it's where you can see most of the bigger climate impacts. Of course, there are climate impacts in the global north, and they are devastating. There are wildfires in the US, for example, that are devastating. There were huge wildfires in Australia, and there are floodings, and there are really dramatic events already. We can all see unequivocally climate change by this point. But the impacts that these same events can have on countries in the global south are devastating. So, for example, I am from Central America, and a few years ago, in 2020, we had a very extreme hurricane season. So the in a given season, like a really extreme season, for example, you would expect hurricanes from the scale of 1 to 5, and the level 5 hurricanes are really, really extreme and are really rare. Like you only see one of those a decade. And only in 2020, the region was impacted by 2 of these hurricanes in a matter of weeks. And this caused a huge amount of losses, of human losses, but also it led to other social conflicts. It led to heavy losses on agriculture, heavy losses on rural areas, which in turn led to an increasing level of migration from the Central America into the global north. So that is just one way, for example, in which this in which you can see the disparities. Like when these events hit the global south, it leads to really dramatic social conditions afterwards, and many people are forced to migrate because some of these lands are left unusable. They are completely destroyed. So to avoid some of these impacts and some of the worst impacts from the climate crisis, all of the world convened in Paris in 2015 to agree on how they would reduce their climate emissions, so mostly the CO2 emissions. And all of the world agreed on a framework on how to do it called the Paris Agreement. So that is very important to keep in mind. The Paris Agreement is like the goal and the way that the world is planning to reduce those climate warming emissions. And basically, it set the target to keep the world under 2 degrees of warming, which you might have seen in many in many climate news and journalistic articles. You will frequently see that figure, the 2-degree figure, and that comes from the Paris Agreement, and basically it tells the world this is the limit that we're establishing from which we cannot pass. The one issue is that at the moment, our current policies are not enough to keep us under that limit. And in fact, the ideal limit, according to the Paris Agreement again, is 1.5 degrees. And there is a huge difference. It might sound like just a fraction of a degree. It might sound really, really small, but there's a huge difference in the amount of losses and the amount of suffering that fraction of a degree can have. So our current policies are not putting us on the path to 2 degrees, much less to 1.5 degrees, which is the ideal scenario. And our current policies are much more aligned with a 3-degree scenario of warming, which would cause really heavy impacts on all over the world, but especially in the global south. So what do we do as journalists when in the face of all of this? We're on the brink of a global humanitarian crisis, and basically it depends on all of the world agreeing on how to do it and actually implementing those changes. So that is a tough challenge, and one thing that we need to understand from the start as climate journalists is that in general, talking about climate change is not a simple thing. Um, that is a very important point, because there are many psychological barriers even that that keep us from really grasping the urgency of climate change. Climate change is a very complex topic, because we are not used to such we're not used to a crisis at such big dimensions over such long periods of time. And we are also not used to the type of transformation that this crisis needs from us. So imagine it requires basically changing our whole energy system, which is the basis of almost all global economies. So basically, it demands us to change everything about ourselves, or we're going to suffer very, on very big dimensions, but over slow periods of time. So that is kind of a complex issue. It's not our usual crisis, right? It's not COVID, where there was a spike in cases in a matter of months, but it's more of a um, long-term crisis, where there will be a number of emergencies popping up, and they will spike. They will only keep growing. They are not coming down with the months. Like for example, doing an analogy with COVID-19. So as I mentioned, there are some there are also, well, social barriers, but also psychological barriers that keep us from understanding just how urgent this issue is. And one of them, this is one of the many models that exist. Some psychologists, for example, um, argue that our brains were not designed to even understand the type of problem that climate change is. We were designed to immediate crises, to solve immediate problems such as hunger or getting somewhere to rest. Very immediate, that you can feel at the moment, and that you have to resolve quickly. But climate change is not that type of issue, and this is one model proposed by this Norwegian psychologist called Per Espen Stoknes. And he wrote this book called What We Think When We're Trying Not to Think About Climate Change. And it basically proposes this model in which there are a number of barriers that keep us from understanding it. So, for example, it might feel distant. It might feel like it will happen to my, I don't know, to a distant person in the future, but not really to me or anyone that I know. It feels like it may be too big to solve. So it may you may feel like it's worthless to even try to solve it. You might have there may be some denial issues, or there may be cognitive dissonance. In you may know, for example, with cognitive dissonance, you may know how urgent it is and how bad things are, but you still don't change your attitude because there are no external pressures forcing you to change that attitude. So he proposes this model of different layers, and with every layer inside of that circle, each one is harder to break. Is what he proposes. So that is one model. Obviously, it's one very popular model, but there are a lot of models that exist around the psychological barriers that we face in order to understand climate change. But that is one good framework to start from, and this is one of the ways in which, based on some of the research that he and other authors propose, this is some of the ways that we in Climate Tracker try to approach climate stories in order to break those psychological barriers and to be more effective on our messaging. So our climate stories, as I like to point out to all of our fellows, are about people, are about power, and are about thinking in creative terms. So what do I mean by this? So climate stories, we can often get lost in data. We can often get lost on the latest scientific paper, and we can often look at the latest research and get lost interviewing, all of the scientists involved, the politicians involved, and these in fact are the main sources in where studies have been conducted on this. The main sources for climate stories um, are scientists, politicians, and they are often from the global north and typically white. So how do we change this, and why the need to change this? Well, because most of the climate impacts uh, are happening on the ground, in grassroots communities, and are not necessarily happening at the same rate in comparison with the people that are getting interviewed on our climate stories. So focusing on people means conveying just how the climate crisis is affecting us at a local level, and it is affecting our neighbors, our relatives, how it's affecting everyone at a very local level. So I'll show you examples about this. Climate stories are also about power. It's impossible to deny the power dynamics that move around climate change, and we need to be very aware of them because we're going into an age. We're in a weird transition moment, but we're going into an age where most people will be interested in climate change and will try to portray themselves as climate heroes. But that is not necessarily the case, especially with with industries that have been perpetuating and have been the main drivers of the climate crisis that we're facing right now. So we need to be very aware of that. As I mentioned at the start, we need to be aware of the inequalities that exist in terms of emissions. We need to be aware that most of those emissions from CO2 that I showed you come from a handful of companies in the energy sector, particularly companies from the oil and gas sector, and well, especially also other fossil fuels like carbon and other sources of energy. But we need to be very aware that the climate crisis has the main driver of the climate crisis is concentrated in a very closed circle that is very easily identifiable, and so we need to understand those dynamics that are going on and that are at play on our stories. As for thinking creatively, I think it's also quite important because the climate crisis is happening everywhere and it's happening to everyone in every sector. So basically, what this means is you can find a climate story basically everywhere. It's just a matter of thinking creatively. And I think the best climate stories for me, at least, are the ones that I like the most, are the ones that show me a different angle on linking something that I didn't expect to be related to climate change, but where these stories show me that there is in fact a clear connection and there is an interesting new angle to this. So I think that this is a very important element of you know of contributing with something new to climate coverage, is trying to think in creative terms and trying to think, well, for example, with the last Olympic Games, to give an example, how did climate change affect that? How did extreme heat in Japan, for example, affect athletes competing in their disciplines? And there were incidents where some athletes, for example, fainted because of the extreme heat that was going on at the moment. And so that's just one example, for example. where you can see the connection with climate change, but that maybe there were no climate journalists probably covering the Olympics, or very few at least. So that is just one example where I saw where I see that you could think in creative terms. So this is one example from Climate Tracker that combines a bunch of these principles that I think was really effective. So this is a story from one of our fellows in Uganda. And what he did was he didn't uh, he didn't go to a site in the midst of the crisis. So, for example, there was a huge flood in this lake in Uganda, and the story is not about the flood itself. It's not about the immediate uh, in the immediate impact of what happened during that event. But the story is more about what happened afterwards. So what he did was he came back to that very site that had been affected by floods a few months ago, and he realized that there were a great number of children who never got to go back to school after the impact of the floods. So what he found was a bunch of deserted schools. Some of them were basically abandoned and were taken by cattle. Um, others were, growing plants in the middle of the building. Uh, so this is just one example of how he tried to think in creative terms and tried to find creative ways of reporting the climate story. So he didn't go to the immediate emergency at the moment, but he instead thought, let's go to a place that has suffered an immediate emergency in the past and see how that has transformed the site. And what he found was, children, for example, were not having a decent access to education. Of course, here is a more detailed a more detailed version of the same three principles. But another way that we try to incorporate that into our stories was, for example, with this story, in which one of our fellows from India analyzed the Asia Development Bank new energy policy. And what she found was a lot of the regulations were aimed at reducing fossil fuels, but the energy policy was leaving a huge door for natural gas projects, which is also a fossil fuel. So the bank was instead not abandoning fossil fuels completely, but rather focusing on gas instead of coal and oil projects. So this is a way that she reviewed the many documents of the ADB's energy policy. She went through a list of all of the projects that were planned for that year, and she realized, no, the bank is not abandoning fossil fuels at all, but it's just changing the type of fossil fuel that it wants to use. So that was another example that I think was very effective in fiscalizing the institutions in power here. So a final set of not I think there are a few more slides, but another thing to keep in mind when doing the stories is try to frame it in a global context. So, for example, if you are covering a extreme weather impact in a given region, try to think or try to look for data on what other extreme weather events have happened nearby. If there were any, if you're covering a cyclone, for example, in I don't know, in Africa, try to think: have there been any other cyclones nearby in the last few years? Have there been similar cyclones in other parts of the world? What tendencies and what trends can be observed in extreme weather. Because the thing is, a lot of these extreme events tend to be covered as isolated events that just happen and that are a crisis, but are never put in the context of climate change. And that is really important to try to not only cover the emergency at the moment, but also try to think in bigger terms and try to see the big picture and try to understand, well, there is a trend of a lot more extreme weather going on in this region, and it's identifiable by this and this and this source. So that's quite an important thing, I think. Try to include the latest science, climate science. So that's another thing that the most that some of the research on this on climate media coverage has realized, and that a lot of the stories don't include any mention to climate scientists and to the latest climate science, and that is quite important because it is the most it's the most solid foundation on why these changes need to happen. Of course, it's also important to include data, and there are a lot of open source tools at the moment. So this is another example that we published in Climate Tracker. Another fellow from India, she was looking at deforestation in a given in a very specific region in India, and she had a lot of people in the ground telling her that deforestation was rampant and that a lot of trees were being cut. But what the official government reports was saying was that there were actually more forests than before. So there was some contradiction. And for this story, we used satellite data from an open source platform called Global Forest Watch. And we were able to see there that actually, no, the deforestation was increasing in that particular region. And what the government was doing was including a lot of plantations. So, for example, palm tree plantations and other crops, and including that as forests. So, actually, no, there weren't more forests. There were less forests, and we could even observe that and even have satellite images of that. So that was one way in which we tried to use open data tools to prove our hypothesis on the story. So another thing that another idea that I would try to recommend is trying to focus on solutions. And this is not only beneficial for our audiences because solutions journalism is quite popular. It has some good numbers, and there are many studies that suggest that readers trust more in solutions journalism than in regular problem-focused journalism. But it conveys, I think, another important couple of points that are linked to the psychological barriers that we mentioned at the start, and is that the climate crisis is bad, but there's still hope. And like we mentioned at the start of the webinar, the latest climate science, in fact, tells us there's not only there's hope, but here's the way that we can achieve a lesser impact from climate change. So that's, I think, a very important message that is conveyed very well by solutions journalism. Another important distinction is that every fraction of degree matters. So a world with 2 degrees is significantly better than a world with 2.5 degrees. A world with 1.5 degrees is significantly better than a world with 2 degrees. So every fraction, every effort that can lead us closer to that lesser degree of warming is worth it, and that is a very important we overshoot our limits, and even if things get bad, there's still efforts to be made because it can get so much worse, right? So we try to be, we should try to be thinking in those terms as well. This is one example of one solution story that that I really liked, and it showed how people in Brazilian favelas, which are kind of slums in major cities in Brazil, were organizing themselves to install solar energy, because it was way more accessible for them than to follow the conventional the conventional methods to access energy. So that's one interesting way. Uh, and here we should also be or also note that there are the climate coverage needs to be consistent over time. So this graph shows this is from the a research station at the University of Colorado in the US, and it shows the climate coverage at a global level. You can see here by each continent and the color it represents. And you can see here, for example, that climate change coverage tends to spike when there are events. So, for example, you can see here the climate COPs in 2020, in 2015, and 2010 that were really significant climate COPs. But in recent years, you can see that this coverage has mainly has gone up. There we are seeing an increase in climate change news. But when we look at the specific places where it's happening everywhere, but the places where it's happening at a faster rate, which are these two lines here, it's through wire services and through media in North America and and Europe. So what we're seeing essentially is climate change is getting more coverage and it's getting more attention, and that is wonderful news because it's a huge crisis and we really need to be paying attention to it. But what we're seeing is we're still not paying enough attention in the global south, especially in some of the most vulnerable regions in the world, and that is where efforts need to increase. And we need to increase capabilities of journalists there so that we can have a stronger coverage of climate issues as it is happening in countries in the global north. One last, and this is one of the last things. I swear I'm about to finish. But one last thing I think is that we should be also attentive to our audience. So, for example, this is a study by the Yale Climate Communications Program, and what they did was to segment the audiences in the U.S. into six categories. So they kind of disseminated the whole climate spectrum, and they defined some people as more alarmed, others concerned, others are cautious but are not really taking huge actions into climate change, but they do know that it's an issue. There are people that are disengaged, that simply don't care that much. There are people that are doubtful or dismissive. These are like the most the ones that are less eager to take action, for example. But the needs of each one of these audiences change with depending on where do they fall into this spectrum. So, for example, people that are more dismissive to the climate crisis say they need more evidence. And so the type of coverage that they need is actually, and that is useful to them, is really different from the ones who are more alarmed, who are actually demanding who want to take action, but maybe don't know exactly how, or they need more tips on how to take action. So they are looking for a more solutions or more action-based focus from their media consumption. So I think this is an important graph to take in mind, because the needs of your audience will change depending on where do they fall in this spectrum. And now just to finish quickly, I want to also highlight that we should keep an eye out now for greenwashing, which is kind of the new, it's been branded as the new climate denial. Um, and is one of the most, I think, the one of the issues that can damage the most effective climate action, because it can distract us, or it can sell us, you know, actions that are not helping to reduce emissions. They can sell, it can potentially sell some of these actions as beneficial when they're not. And that very same problem, I think, is happening with certain climate solutions that are being branded as our, you know, as the savior of everyone, but that maybe aren't as solid as they're being sold as. So I think for the next few years, we need to be really aware that these things are happening and that these are some of the major trends happening. And finally, human rights are really important, especially with energy projects. So also keep an eye out in the next few years for if there are increased energy and increased renewable energy projects nearby. Try to keep an eye out for if to um, they are managing to include local communities in a healthy way, if they are being respectful of local communities and of their environment. Uh, that is something that we should be really aware of, because it's often not the case, and in many places, especially again in global south countries, quite the opposite happens, and many even projects based on clean energy can end up being really obstructive of human rights of local populations. So these are like 3 tips that I think are going to be really important in the next few years, and that we as journalists should keep an eye out for. With that, I finished the presentation. I'm sorry for going on overtime, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
Yes, so the time has been fast spent, but while during the course of your presentation, I started this is my board of climate, environment, journalism, reporting, buzzwords. And this was something that happened to me during the last COP26 that I attended, courtesy of the Climate Track Initiative. So immediately I entered the hall, so many different sessions, different buzzwords, that it was really, really difficult to make sense of how all of these things can be dealt with convincingly across the world, especially in developing countries. And it's made me realize the fact that we cannot expect climate reporting to be reported the same way in different parts of the world. You can't be talking to, let's look at, for instance, one of the underlying rules at COP26 was that petroleum oil is very bad. It's very bad for environment. But my country, Nigeria, oil is the major source of revenue. So how do you expect the media to report that to their local audience, and for the government to also aggressively do something serious about that? So how do we factor in these local variations in terms of priorities into our global local climate change reporting? And how does a media organization that is also interested in committing more pages to environment journalism, how do you think they can go about this such that their content will be locally relevant? The mic is off.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so the local focus, as you mentioned, is crucial. Again, to be able to make an engaging coverage and a distinctive coverage, and precisely as you mentioned, the needs of every audience shifts depending on a lot of on the context, right? So the needs for information on in the US may be very different from the needs for information in Nigeria. And what I would suggest is in general, I think it's a great rule in general to have a close relationship with your audience, to get to know them, to understand what are their needs, and what they are demanding to know, right? Because I mean, you can completely ignore them if you want, but you won't have any readers. So the idea is having a tight relationship with your audience also helps you understand what type of coverage and what type of climate coverage even um, is necessary for them, and what can you provide that is distinctive. So that also comes with one of the principles that I mentioned in trying to be creative and trying to think from your surroundings. Where can you find a climate story? Typically, that helps you cover the story in a much more local way, and it also helps you to find more distinctive stories that have a value, an added value. Of course, if you cover a climate report, everyone is going to cover it, and there will be a press release even. So how do you cover that very same report from a local perspective? Or how do you cover a major event, for example, a COP, and how do you make it a local event? Um, so, for example, how is your country doing in the negotiations? What is it pushing for? What is it not pushing for? Um, in what with who is it forming alliances? Those type of dynamics, for example, can turn a global story happening at COP26 and turn it into a local story that may be of increased interest and be distinctive uh, to your audience, and can give some added value uh, in comparison to the other information that they're getting, because through the internet they're still going to get um, the global major publications. They're still going to get Reuters. They're still going to get the New York Times. So what can you do different from those outlets to turn that story into a local story? I think that's crucial.
Yeah,
Definitely.
thank you very much. So we have a number of questions that I hope you can quickly take. The first one is from Chris, and I'll combine these with the question from Oyedele. Chris writes, what are the opportunities for and challenges in working remotely in environmental and climate focused journalism? While Oyedele is asking, are there interventions to help climate change communication researchers in universities to also tell the stories since they have a scientific findings?
Yeah, so opportunities are a huge issue, right? And especially when covering it from global south countries. Uh, there are a number of organizations doing this, and well, of course, Climate Tracker is trying to open as many opportunities as we can. But we're also happy to see a lot more NGOs, a lot more journalistic organizations such as ICFJ joining the climate crisis and its coverage. And I think there are a lot more opportunities now open for journalists than there were before. Um, there are also a lot of online tools um, that can help you.
I think Sebastian has frozen. Christina, are you there?
Hi,
Okay,
Paul.
okay.
Did I lose you?
Yeah, you're talking about opportunities.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I must have broken up. No, I was saying that what I would suggest is try to look for opportunities in some organizations like ICFJ or like Climate Tracker or other journalistic organizations that are opening up to the climate conversation. But also try to stay up to date as much as possible. Try to read uh, as many outlets as possible, especially climate focused news sites. So there are a number of climate focused environmental focused news sites. Uh, and what I would suggest is try to read as many of them as possible and try to stay as updated as possible.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the next question is from Joseph. Joseph is asking, do you have any suggestions for resources or readings which can inspire us to discuss climate change in our stories?
Yeah, I mean that goes very linked with what I was mentioning. So there are a number of really good climate focused media outlets that I would suggest. There is Carbon Brief. The Guardian has a great climate crisis section. Um, I would suggest reading on the one of the graphs that I showed, or many I think of, were from the Yale Climate Communications Program. Did I break up again? I saw you.
No, yeah, okay, it's okay.
Okay, yeah. No, what I would suggest is those that I mentioned. The Yale Climate Communications Program has some great resources. If you want to read more about climate communications in general, and the NASA has also a great briefing and resources on climate science. So if you're new to this and you want to know some of the basics of it, NASA has some great resources as well if you want to read more.
Yeah, before we go, I can give the mic to allow one or two comments. Christina, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, Christina, so I'd like you to share your personal experience reporting renewable energy in Germany. So how have you been able to, what is your personal perception?
Well, in the past, yeah,
yes.
in the past, it was much focused on increasing. Well, climate journalism was basically based on reporting on renewables. I think this is changing now a lot because I'll give you a simple example, and I think Sebastian said this very clearly. To make a solar panel, you need lithium. To get lithium, you have to dig it somewhere out, and how this is done. If it is done in Chile or maybe done in Portugal now, which has also big sources, and how it affects really the local communities. That's important in reporting, I think. And that has changed the last years, that the normal people are much more conscious about not only what they can do, maybe putting solar panels also on their roofs, but how companies are really operating in that area. Are they really being sustainable, or are they just doing greenwashing? And I think that's the big chance for a lot of upcoming young journalists to get in this local reporting focused on this global topic. We have to stop climate change effects.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think Sebastian said it also really well. One of the understandings that we've come to realize regarding environmental journalism is it's more effectively when you are able to localize it. Thank you very much, Christina, for that contribution. Sheikh Salim, I see your hand up. Would you like to speak? Hello? Okay. Yes. So on that note, we've already run out of the time, but I can quickly ask Sebastian, in a nutshell, what do you think the take-home message for journalists should be? And everybody will be talking about the World Environment Day. How do you think journalists can uniquely leverage on this event to write really locally relevant stories that would be even more relevant even beyond the celebration?
Yeah, I think one of one of the key takeaway messages is the one that we started with, was and it's that the climate crisis can generate anxiety, can feel dreadful at times, but there are reasons to keep hope. There are even moral obligations to cover this right, and to give proper information about this. And also there is the principle that every degree and every fraction of a degree that we can make the world lower its emissions, it's going to be a better world. So what we should try to hold on to is trying to find the necessary tools to cover this right, and to make the necessary efforts to cover this in a way that it helps your local audience. Um, but always, when at times you feel like it may be too much, always try to remember that there are still reasons to have hope, and there are still and not only from climate science, by the way. What Christina mentioned, I think, is a huge reason to be hopeful. Just how much awareness is growing all over the world about this issue, and I think that is huge. It's something that didn't happen just, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. So the fact that we have a climate movement now, the fact that we have climate science recommendations telling us what to do, even. So at times it may feel like a lot, but that is, I think, one of the key elements that we can take away from this.
Yeah, some really good questions came in. Sorry for that. Sheikh Salim bin Ahmad is back. Do you want to ask your question live, or should I read it loud for you? Okay, let me start reading it. So it goes thus. In South Asian countries like ours, Ahmad is joining us from Kashmir in India. Climate reporting has taken a back seat as there are many other issues to report on front pages. Can you please suggest a few tips that will help motivating editors to carry climate change stories? Usually such stories get killed in local press. That is one question. I also combined two questions that, wow. Okay, and I think, so can you answer that while I give the mic to Temilade Aloko to also ask a question? Can you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's actually one big issue, and one difficulty that comes from many countries in the global south, and that there seems to always be a more urgent matter, right? In a country where, for example, there is a military conflict, it's very difficult to try to think ahead and try to plan against climate change. Of course, that is very natural, and of course, the coverage and the media coverage will adjust to that context. So I don't think there's one answer and one key answer to that. But I would have what I suggest, and what I think it has been very effective with some of our fellows, is trying to relate, like I mentioned, in thinking creatively, trying to relate the current context of each of our countries to climate change. So, for example, in a country where there is a military conflict, try to think, how is the climate crisis making that conflict even worse? How is, for example, affecting food supplies? How is it affecting access to water, or to health? So, for example, if there is no water, how can we attend the people that are injured in a military conflict? We covered a bunch of stories about this from Yemen. One of our fellows was from Yemen, and she managed to find a way to cover this with with that angle of trying to find how the climate crisis is making these conflicts even worse. So what I would recommend is trying to link those two together to your local context. Of course, this is the context of Yemen, and it may well change depending on each country. But usually that is a tool that can attract editors a bit more.
Yeah, our last question is from Timilade. Timilade, are you ready?
Okay, yes, I'm here. My question is just like I asked, like in Nigeria, we all know some ministries when you go there, it's so much difficult to get what exactly you want. And to get your response balance, you need to contact some people, a resource person. But when they refuse to talk, they refuse to tell you the exact thing that you need to know, that you need to write about. It's always a problem. So sometimes you just get at the middle of your report and hang back. Because some of them, they might not want to talk, maybe not panic, some cover up from corruption or whatever. So in such situations, how do we get a comprehensive and a balanced report as a reporter, especially that has interest on climate change? Thank you.
Sebastian?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the question very well.
Okay, the question she asked was that sometimes it's extremely difficult to get materials, reports, independent reports that would be necessary to write such stories on climate change. So when these data, these reports, this information are not easily accessible to journalists, what should they do?
Yeah, that tends to happen. It tends to happen a lot, actually. And we, or at least I try to recommend a number of ways to find our way around that. So there are many open access tools that where you can access data. There is, as I mentioned, for example, if you're looking at data on deforestation, there is Global Forest Watch. If you're looking at fishing data, there is Global Fishing Watch. If you're looking at emissions data, the European Union has a great database on global emissions where you can see each country's emission by year. So try to find maybe open access global data. That may well be a possible solution for your story. If you need a bit more specific data, that can also happen. That, for example, in a deforestation in a specific region in your country, and you need a government data on this, but you know it doesn't exist. We try or at least what we try to do is try to find other ways to express that very change in land use through maybe other forms in which we can perceive it. So, for example, one of our fellows had this very same problem. She was trying to get data on deforestation in a specific region, but it just didn't exist. And there wasn't, of course, any global data because it looked at countries, not at specific regions. So what we did in that case was she asked the local community, how had the landscape of the community changed in the last 50 years? So one of the elders, for example, told her that I don't know, 40 years ago, the trees used to reach the very entrance of the town. But now the trees are far away from the town. You can only find them across the river, which is a few kilometers away from the main village. And so you're maybe there you're not being exact with your data. You're not being super precise on how much has that changed. But in that way we're being able to express the change. We're being able to use some alternative reporting tools to express that something changed in that community, and we use that description as an alternative source of data. Of course, we need to complement that with large scale data, and in that case we complement it with Global Forest Watch and deforestation data on a national level. But we did use the testimonial on how it looked like, and how that changed. That can also often be very useful. So I wouldn't underestimate, for example, local communities and local knowledge. because there are many answers there where there is no data available.
Yes, so thank you very much, Sebastian. And we've gone far beyond the time allocated for the session. So on behalf of the entire ICJ team, I want to thank you very much for making our time to be with us on this session. And to our journalists and everyone in attendance, I hope you've been able to gain one or two things in expanding your ability to report on the environment and climate change in general. And I think for us, the key message today regarding how to effectively report on climate change and the environment is to endeavor to localize this as much as possible. The audience will only resonate well enough with something that they know more closely. So while this is a global issue, it should best be approached from a truly local perspective. So for you, I can see lots of inquiries about videos of this session and the slides. I would please implore Sebastian to please email the slides to me so that we can pass it on to our participants. And please, when you do that, those that would like to access it, please, there is a link I just put in the chat. Please check it out. That is a direct link to our Facebook forum where I will be sharing the video of this session and the slides with you. And if you'd like to know more about the ICFJ's other initiatives, especially this particular initiative, please check out ICFJ website on www.icfj.org. And we have lots of resources for you on environmental journalism and several others. So I implore you to also check out the HygieNet network on www.hygienet.org. And if you are reporting anything, on the environment for the World Environment Day, we are able to help you expand the reach of your story by sharing your stories with our audience. And if you're using any tool that we've shared today, any insights and information, we'd like to know so that we can further help you in improving your environmental journalism reporting skills. So please, in addition to being part of that forum on Facebook, you can easily reach out to me for anything that you need, and I'll endeavor to make it happen for you. So that's my ICFJ email address. And on behalf of everybody, I want to thank Sebastian and the entire Climate Tracker initiative for agreeing to join us today. It's been an eye-opening and truly useful session for me and the entire audience. So thanks, Sebastian. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day. We'll see you some other time. Bye from me.
Thanks to you, Paul, and thanks everyone that joined.